Hello, and welcome to the Bianca Williams podcast. I am your host, Bianca Williams, and this is the podcast where we get into self-growth tips. We are sharing amazing backstories of healing and just overcoming different struggles in life, and we are sharing the gift of wisdom. And today, you guys are in for a treat because we have Dr. Frank Byndloss, a clinical psychologist, who is going to get into a requested topic. So I'm super, super excited to have him here to talk about this, his expertise, his experience, and just how natural it is for him to share information and you to really absorb it. And so get ready to take some notes, share this with people that you feel will be just benefit from this, family members, friends, all of that. We are talking about men and mental health, specifically getting into emotional intimacy. I know some people are like, hey, what's this thing with Black men, all of that fun stuff. So yes, I am super excited to get to this topic. I want to just start with, again, thank you, Dr. Byndloss, for joining me today. And if you could just share a little bit about your background, your experience, things that help people understand just how amazing you are as a psychologist.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been doing this type of work. I've been working in the mental health field for, almost like the last 19 years now. Currently, I work in private practice, but I've worked in so many different settings. As far as my training is concerned, I'm a trained trauma therapist. I specialize in working with adolescents, young boys, young men, specifically coming from like urban areas, dealing with a lot of urban trauma, dealing with a lot of family conflict, those types of things. I've kind of jumped around to different places and different spaces. I have worked in community mental health settings. I've worked in like the juvenile justice system. I worked in the prison system. I've worked in the academic centers. I've pretty much done a whole bunch of stuff. But over the last 5 years, 5 years ago, I kind of stepped out of that light and went into private practice. When I went into private practice, I specifically wanted to kind of fill a void or fill a gap, specifically here in Nashville, where I practice, in providing mental health services to people of color. It was my intention in the beginning to continue to work with like adolescents and teenagers. But this was right around the time of like the George Floyd and a lot of political unrest and those types of things that really popped up. And so the moment that I opened my private practice, I just got bombarded with people of color, Black men, um, with all kind of different requests and asks, right? So it was things about like, hey, I have a bunch of trauma and I want to work through my trauma. It was a lot of like relationship issues. It was a lot of, hey, I need some life coaching or some executive coaching. I want to figure out how I need to move up the ladder. And so over the last 5 years, that's really kind of where I've honed my practice and honed my specialty. So now I focus on working with men of color from all over the spectrum, still with a lot of different things. Moreover, biggest piece that I work with though is getting men to be in touch with kind of their own feelings, understanding that as a person of color, as a man, that we actually do have feelings and we can actually explore those things. And then also understanding kind of how those feelings impact relationships with significant others, children, those types of things. So that's really where I've been focused over the last 5 years, though.
Wow, it sounds like you've done some of everything. And so that makes you obviously the perfect person to be able to talk about this. I'm really
Sure.
excited that that happens to be the general population that you find yourself working with the most, and your experience lends you towards really being an asset in their lives and their recovery and their healing. This is amazing. And so, and you're a Black man yourself. So it's not,
All
I'll
my
say
life.
being in this field, having exposure to different settings is really key to your, just your just professional skill set, because it just widens your lens, your perspective, and you just have so many different ways of navigating different things. So I appreciate that you have taken the time to go through that, because I know going through all of those different settings can be difficult, and you're learning different systems, different politics. I mean, it's just so much that comes out of that. And even working in different, I don't know, regions of the country, I would say even kind of shows you different things that's happening.
For sure.
Yes, perfect guess. I want to ask you if you could, because you talked about emotional intimacy, especially with men.
Mhm.
If you could define emotional intimacy from your perspective and why that is so important for men to cultivate.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I think, it's a really weird, nuanced thing, right? So when we start to think about emotional intimacy, I don't know how most people feel, but like it's always like, oh, do I give you hugs? Do I give you kisses? Am I in touch with my emotions? And like that is more of the like social zeitgeist of what emotional intimacy looks like. But when I talk about emotional intimacy is more about being able to kind of like explore areas and fears that you've never been to, right? So it's not just about intimacy with another person, it could be intimacy within yourself, right? So there's a lot of times we block off parts of our lives because maybe we don't want to actually go through and explore those things. Maybe it's too dangerous or too difficult or too scary to talk about, how I feel about myself, how I feel about my own my own job as a psychologist, or my life as a man or a husband or a dad or a lawyer, whatever it may be. So it's really like, to start the definition, it's really more about understanding the ability to actually access those spaces, right? And once we start to access those spaces, it is about learning how do we navigate those spaces and learning how do we navigate our relationships, learning how do we navigate, you know, a lot of our trauma and experiences that come up. A lot of times when we talk about like intimacy, like I said, the first thing that we go to is like sexual intimacy, right? And if we use the idea of sexual intimacy as kind of like the template and understanding intimacy, you got to think about like, what is it, right? Sexual intimacy is you taking down your guard and giving your body to another person, right? Which is arguably physically the most intimate thing that you could actually do, right? And so when we talk about emotional intimacy, we can kind of look at it through the same lens. And it's about being able to take down your guard and actually share your emotions and explore your emotions, either that be with yourself or that be with other people, right? And so what I find is a lot of people just don't have that, especially as men of color, right? We're not socialized to be emotional, right? We're socialized to have one emotion, and that's usually anger, right? And that's the way that we kind of like funnel all of those other feelings into like our intimacy. It's always through anger. That's the only thing that's okay, right? But I don't know if many people understand that we're all human, right? We're human, and so we do feel the range of feelings, but a lot of times, like I said, we can't identify them. We don't really get it. A lot of times we think that our anger is just anger and frustration, but it could be sadness, it could be fear, it could be anxiety, right? And the process of understanding emotional intimacy is being able to unlock that, understanding like, hey, these are the feelings that I'm having. And then the second step would be, how do they actually impact the world? How do they impact the people that I'm with, right?
Yeah. I think one thing that stood out to me is the way you explain intimacy and emotional access. And a lot of people see it as external. And you're saying like there's this huge piece of that that's more internal than external. So like just the whole idea of emotional intimacy is almost like, I don't know, compartmentalized in this way that it's something to do with somebody else or something that has to do with your body in some way. And really it's the internal processing system. Yes, that part exists, but it also comes from this internal place. And so that was huge. And you also mentioned, how men are socialized. And I think that definitely plays a huge role in why sometimes that inner emotional intimacy just isn't as, I don't know, even present or the awareness isn't there. Because if you're like socialized to see everything as external or the only emotion you're able to access is, this, and we know that's not even the primary emotion, it's always coming from something else, then it makes sense why it's like it seems like there's a gap, right? In what you're actually experiencing and feeling and processing versus what you're doing, what you feel like you're supposed to do. And so I want to get into that for a second, if you don't mind, just kind of going into like what do you feel societal expectations in traditional gender roles, like how did that impact men's ability to express and develop emotional intimacy?
I mean, I think it has, like, to zoom out even before we get to the men's piece, right? I think a lot of times we do experience things in this weird binary way, right? It's either right or it's wrong. It's good or it's bad. It's up or it's down, right? And whenever we do that, we rob ourselves from everything that's in the middle, right? And we do this a lot with emotions, but specifically, like I said, us as men, we're socialized to live in this binary world, right? You think about it, right? You're weak or you're strong. There's no in between, right? Either you're the have or you're the have-nots. There's no in between. Specifically, as we go through this process of developing as boys, and we sit there and we see the world as a dangerous place at times. I mean, I don't I know you have kids, but I raise a young boy, right? My son's 10 years old, and it's a really, really interesting process to see my son start to navigate the world and start to understand who he is in the world and how the world sees him. And it's really easy to fall into this place. I mean, this is like the kid that I've known since before he knew himself, right? He's a cute little kid and the greatest smile and the curliest hair. And you know what I mean? He's just the sweetest thing ever.
He is.
He is, but he's getting bigger. He's 10. And I recognize as a father and as a man that at some point in time, society is going to see him in this binary way, right? Is going to see him in is he's either a threat or he's not a threat, right? And so part of it is me saying, okay, well, I have to help him understand what he's going through and how society is going to see him. And a lot of times, when we have to get pushed in this binary way of either we're a threat or we're not a threat, we don't have time, we don't have space to explore emotions, right? We don't have space to talk about, oh, this is how I feel. It's like, no, no, no. I need to make sure that I define myself as either a threat or not a threat, right? And keep in mind, even in the world that we live in today, a lot of times defining yourself as a threat is a functional thing, right? It's what keeps you safe. You got to be a badass, right? Oh, I got to be tough. Can't nobody pick with me. Can't nobody mess with me. You know what I mean? We're
Mhm.
defining ourselves as a threat in order to be safe. But once we define ourselves as a threat, guess what can't come in? Emotions, right? We
Yeah.
feelings, those types of things. And so as we go through this process of like entering into the world and starting to live in these dialectics, I think we're kind of like funneled to those places, right? If we look at the flip side and we look at like the feminine gender roles, right? The feminine gender roles usually don't have to define themselves on the threat side. It's usually the other side, right? I have to be nurturing. I have to be not a threat, blah, blah, blah. As a Black woman, I imagine you find yourself in spaces where you're like, I know I want to say something, but there's some things and some stereotypes out there that if I say this, if
Right.
I say how I feel, if I say what's going on, then they're going to define me as XYZ, right? You feel in
Right.
it's a family oriented podcast, so we won't use all those words, but they will define you in that way, right? So what do? You socialize yourself to kind of turn down and move into that non threat space, right? So
Yeah.
as you move into that non-threat space, there's a whole bunch of things that actually become available to you now, right? Emotions become more acceptable and available to you now because you don't pose a threat to society, right? But as you move into the threat space, there's no room for emotions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Except for anger, right? Anger is the only emotion that actually allows us to exist in that threat space. Why? Because anger is this projection of me being a threat, right? And keep in mind, I use threat and non threat in these weird ways, right? Because it's not necessarily always negative, right?
Yeah.
Growing up
Yeah.
in Oakland, being in a lot of different spaces and places, yeah, man, if I poke my chest out, if I look big and bad, ain't nobody gonna mess with me, right? I'm a
Right.
threat,
Yep.
but like, it's a good thing. You know what I mean? It's a good thing. And so I think that society has this way of kind of like putting us in those boxes. But also when we move into starting to look at like, all right, we'll focus on the male side again, and specifically like men of color side. Historically, that's just not a role that we've filled, right? Historically, the role that we've always filled has been the big, the strong, the provider, the anchor of the family, right? Like it's interesting. You mentioned earlier about how me moving in different places. So like when I first started doing therapy, I lived in Las Vegas. So I lived in Southern Nevada, which is a microcosm in its own world, right? And I grew up I grew up in the Bay Area, which is another different microcosm. And when I went back to get
Very
my
different.
doctorate, I went back to school in the Bay Area. And so there was a culture that was there, right?
Mhm.
And now in 2018, we moved down here to Nashville, and there is definitively a different culture, especially for people of color, right?
Mhm.
And there's this almost this archetype that a lot of my clients talk about now is like, I want to be that stoic granddaddy that just knows everything, that nothing shakes him, right? And this idea is like this big, long, grizzled black man with a beard, the gray beard. Everybody knows the Southern granddaddy stereotype, right?
Right. I'm picturing it.
For sure, right? But I think like what happens is you don't necessarily recognize like what that actually looks like too. Is that Southern granddaddy? Yeah, he's big, strong, and grizzled because he's had to push down a lot of stuff, right? Likely, I mean, depending on what generational cohort we're talking about, like, this could be a granddaddy that grew up in post Reconstruction Jim Crow, right? Or in the 1960s, in the segregation of the 1960s, or even in my case, right? Like, I'm not that old, but like I'm talking about like the impact that I have is like West Coast in the 90s, right? So I'm NWA straight out of Compton, like that's what a man's supposed to look like. You know what I
I was
mean?
like, "Wait a minute." I'm like, uh,
Right? And so we deal with these stereotypes of like as a culture, as people, as cohorts. There's so many things that's projected onto us, but overall, it's always strength, but it's strength at the expense of feelings, right? It's strength at the expense of feelings. And I think part of what I have been working with and part of what I've been seeing a lot in my practice is just that, right? Is this idea of strength at the expense of feelings, whether it comes from like societal pushes, or I mean, maybe we'll talk about it later on, whether it's just an individualized ideal about like, hey, this is who I have to be because this is who I think I need to be. Or, this is who I have to be because this is the setting that I'm in, right? One thing that we don't talk about a lot, you know, I, I I laugh because I've started doing a lot of couples work lately, and
okay.
I never wanted to
I
be on
I
TV.
know.
You know how I felt about that. I was like, no, no, I don't want to be in a reality show, right? But really, what ended up happening was I provided support for Black men, and I'm like one of 6 licensed clinical
I was gonna
psychologists,
it's
Black
so
men
cute.
in the whole state of Tennessee. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But I was working with a lot of my clients. It was just really evident that, like, all right, man, so I'm working with you to talk about your emotional intimacy and to get you to be a little bit softer, to get you to start to kind of undo some of that childhood trauma that built up that wall. But I'm doing that, and then I'm telling you to go back home to your wife, go back home to your partner who's actually not ready to accept you in that way, too. You know what I mean? So there's all of these different figures of like, all right, yeah, you want an emotionally tuned Black man? Girl, you
Right.
better be ready. You know what I mean?
Oh
Like
my god.
you
Yeah.
better be ready. And so part of that moved me into having to work with the system and start to understand like, all right, we have this larger system of society that says that you can't be emotionally attuned or you can't be emotionally intimate or available. Then we have this smaller system of the individual who says, I can't be emotionally attuned. But then in this like Bronson Brenner type of like Russian nesting doll, right? When we look at the next system out, is the next system ready to actually to hold your emotional intimacy, right? And so there's all of those weird different pieces. I know we're going down whatever rabbit hole we go down, but
No, no, I think this is amazing. I I didn't even consider how like the generational versions of, like just what you came up in and where you were affect like even how you define strength, how you access or, even conceptualize emotions. Generally, I guess men, like you said, they kind of are pushed to have one emotion to show up in the world in this way, whether you're ready or not. And one of the things you spoke about, you said, "Oh my first of all, your son 10." I remembered a little bit. So
you're
I
not
was
getting
like, "Wait
petty
a
no
minute."
more. No.
He was like 10 now. And we know that like in I can't speak for the rest of the world, but I know in America, it feel like they age them really fast when they start to hit pre-adolescence and that adolescent years where, we know like this is a kid. They're taller, their voice is deeper, they're in puberty, so their body is changing in all of these different ways. And so people just see them as you're just this big, strong man. And like, no, this is a little boy. And so like it's almost like you're pushed into those societal expectations and gender roles before you're even ready, and the world doesn't give you a chance to say, hey, can I process this? Can I, have a safe space to land? And some of the environments don't support that, right? Because it's not just the society on the men side that's saying that, it's also on the women's side. So what is your mom teaching you? What are the women around you supporting and all of that? I can think of certain examples where, like people have to make choices between, am I going to be a provider and just work, or am I going to have this opportunity to explore my dreams and my goals, which might mean, yes, I'm going to be a provider at work, but I have to pull back in that way so I can give some space in this way, because we all know that you have to give something to get something. And some people are like, no, your role is just this, and I want you to stay there and not change, and that's it. And it's like, and then a lot of times the men just, just normalize that, just digest that, just accept that because they feel like that's their only choice.
Hmm.
And so that was huge. I was thinking about like, dang, just depending on when you were born and where you were born, that totally impacts, just how you access emotional intimacy, if you do at all.
For sure.
And if the people around you, I want to say reward that. For people who I guess is not familiar with that means when I say it like that, like environments kind of reward certain behaviors or certain norms. And so generally people lean towards that. Like I want to do more of the things that people are gonna accept me for doing. People are gonna, give me positive feedback for doing. And some environments are so limiting. I don't use the word toxic. I feel like sometimes it's overused, but some environments don't support healthy development. And so you kind of can get caught up in this cycle of, well, the only things that are rewarded are some of the things that's not as healthy for me. And since that's what my environment supports, then you get kind of stuck in that place of, this is the only way I can do it.
For sure.
Speaking of that, I feel like, being a Black man coming from, like the Bay Area, being able to go to Las Vegas, going to Nashville, like you had your own personal journeys with navigating your emotional intimacy. Do you want to maybe share a time in your life where you struggled and overcame your own challenges with emotional intimacy?
I'm gonna tell you that every day of my life, that's something that we struggle with, right? That I struggle with, you know. As you talk about like just the cohorts and the historical values and this or the historical context, right? I mean, yeah, I was that kid who grew up with, unfortunately, like I was the first generation to have my father in the house, right? So like my grandfather wasn't there for my dad. My dad was raised and his dad was his big brother. You know what I mean? Or was some uncles or
Wow.
someone else, right? So there was no, my dad didn't have this like this template of this is masculinity, this is how you raise your son, right? I had a leg up on the competition, I guess, because my dad worked at juvenile hall for 35 years. So my dad
Oh,
was, yeah, so my dad raised a whole bunch of kids, right? Raised a whole bunch of young men throughout within the context of the juvenile justice system. But there was also a real big skew, right? Because the men that he's or the young boys that he's raising or that he's teaching how to be men, they're not like me, right? Like I wasn't a knucklehead. I wasn't selling dope. I wasn't gangbanging. I wasn't doing all those things. But my dad raised me within this context of like, son, I see how bad the world can actually be. I see what I think that you need in order to do this. And then in reflecting on his process, it's like, I also know what I needed. You know, my dad grew up and he was a teenager in the 1960s, right? So that's
mhm.
a whole other cohort piece of what it means to be a Black
Yeah.
man right now. You're in the 1960s. And so for me, yeah, I never necessarily got the, 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 the emotional intimacy part. I got the
Really?
be tough, be strong, don't never let nobody see you sweat. You know what I mean? If you cry, that's weakness. Don't let them see you cry. Don't share those experiences. Don't share
Wow.
those feelings, right? And it
Yeah.
was a it was a helpful thing, right? So once again, we think about those things. A lot of times we think about it in that negative space, but it helped me survive a lot of situations that I survived, right? But it also made a lot of pieces of me unavailable to myself and a lot of pieces of me unavailable to other people, right? And so as I started to get older and become, my own man, I'm in my late teens, my 20s, and those types of things. It was weird because it wasn't like I didn't have those feelings. You know what I mean? It's not like we cut it off and then those feelings don't come up. It
Right.
is, no,
Exactly.
yeah, I have those feelings and I'm like, what the hell is that? What am I supposed to do with this now? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? I got my heart broken by my first girlfriend. What are we talking about here? Oh, right. And it was one of those weird spaces where, I couldn't necessarily go back to my dad to say, hey, Pop, what do I do? Because when I
Hmm.
did, he would give me some toxic masculinity. Man, look, just let me tell you what you think. You know what I mean? He would go down that road and I'd be like, yeah, I mean, I get that intellectually of like just punch your way out of trouble. But like realistically, I got these feelings and I don't necessarily
Right.
know what to do with them, right? And so it was one of those processes of me always having to acknowledge that those feelings were there and then just compartmentalize them, right? Kind of put them in that box and be like, I'll mess with y'all later. Like, I'll deal with you later. I'm good and move on. It really
Hmm.
wasn't until later on in life, right? So I became a dad. My son was born when I was 32, right? So it was me progress or processing onto these things or moving through a lot of those things. But also, it was became when I came a dad, but also when I actually went back to get my doctorate. So I worked in the mental health field for a while and then went back in 2008, right, to go and start the process of getting my doctorate and being like, this is what I want to do. And in that process, it made me have to do a lot of reflection, right? The way that I learned to do work as a therapist, my mentor used to always say, like, you got all those books, you got all the CBTs, the DBTs, all that other stuff, all that's bullshit. You're
Yeah.
the right? You're the tool. You need to sharpen your own mental acuity. You need to get in touch with your own feelings so that when something is happening inside the therapy room, you can address your feelings so that you can actually be there for your clients too, right? And there
Yes.
was this
Yes.
huge push on this like self-reflective space for me. Right around that time, like I said, I got into a really serious relationship with my now wife and uh, once again started having a lot of those feelings and those feelings were met with like I want to be emotionally intimate, I want to be open with this person, I want to share how I feel, but like damn, is it safe? I don't know if I could do this.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? And like I kind of stumbled my way through that process as well. I mean, my wife is a wonderful, wonderful woman and she puts up with all of my flaws. But I'll be totally honest with you, I stumbled my way through that process as well of understanding like how to be a boyfriend, a fiance, a husband. And then move forward, you have 2015 and my son is born, and I'm like, wait, now I'm in that same space that I remember my dad being in, right? Of like, I
Yeah.
remember looking up to him saying, I have these feelings. And I remember the thoughts that my dad was having. I remember the responses that he was having. And I would tell them, I would challenge myself to say, I got to do different, right? My
Hmm.
dad is not a very affectionate person. He's a great dad, wonderful father, not very
Yeah.
affectionate, right? And so I was like, oh no, absolutely not. Like, I'm gonna tell my kid I love him every day, hugs, kisses, all that other stuff. And now he's in that space of like, Dad, don't kiss me. Don't, he's like, oh wow, this intimacy is weird. And he's figuring it out, right? But I think that
Yeah.
like every day I struggle with it. Every day we process it. I think the difference now though for me is in going through my own therapy, in growing as a clinician, in having so much contact with all of these different people at these different lifespans, right? So, like I told you in the beginning, I was a child therapist by trade, right? I work with adolescents, but of course I work with kids. But in order to work with kids, I also got to work with their parents, right? I got
Yeah.
to engage in these systems, and I'm seeing these kids that are going through things with their parents, and there's these horrible traumas that are happening, and I'm like, wow, I gotta actually teach the kid how to be emotionally open, but also I'll teach the parent how to be emotionally open, while by being emotionally open myself too. Right?
Right.
And it was
Yeah.
this really big push for me of like, Frank, you got to figure this out. Like, you got to push through this. You got to, because it wasn't just me at stake anymore, right? And
Yeah.
now I still laugh because it's still not just me, right? I still have my clients and all that other stuff, but now I'm a dad raising this little boy who's in the world that, like, you know, I don't know how you feel about your kids, but like, I'm like, man, I'm so glad I grew up in the 90s. I'm so glad I grew
Yeah, that
I'm
generational difference is
yeah, when there was
wild.
no if there was a Facebook or an Instagram or a Snapchat in my day, my goodness, I yeah, right? So I'm here trying to help my kid navigate those things, right? All the
Yeah,
while
it's very
having to
different.
yeah, all the while having to be emotionally intimate, right? To say things like, you know, son, instead of doing what was done to me, it was yelling and saying, hey, what are you doing that for? Why are you doing that? Blah, 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 blah. I have to look at him and say, you know what, kid? That hurt my feelings. Like,
Yeah.
when I asked you to do something and you just looked at me and rolled your eyes and scoffed and stomped up the stairs, like, I
Yeah.
was hurt. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, my grandmother, I just hear the ghost of my grandmother in my head saying, whoop that boy's ass. He can't do that to you. You know what I mean? And I'm
That's
sitting
literally it.
for
That's what
sure,
they
right?
say.
And I'm sitting there and I'm like, no, grandmother, like, we don't live in that world. Like, I got to have these feelings. He's got to have these feelings and we got to figure it all out. So, I mean, the roundabout answer to that is like, I struggle with it every day, right? I have struggled with it every day in my life. And to be totally honest with you, Bianca, I don't think we ever succeed in it, right? I think that like it's
Yeah.
like emotional intimacy, connection with other people, connection with ourselves, reflection on ourselves is just a lifelong struggle because it's always changing, right? I just laughed. One of the best pieces of advice my dad gave me about being a parent, he was like, you know that feeling when you're like, you know what, I got this. Yeah, that's bullshit, right? Like, it
Yeah.
is not
If something
real.
gonna happen and you be like, I don't
Yeah,
this
because it's gonna change immediately, right? And it's like, wait a minute, I thought that we was cool 30 seconds ago, and now your kid's like stomping up the stairs, you know,
yeah.
emotional and pissed off, and you're like, what happened to that little kid that you were 17 minutes ago? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So I think
for
that like
sure.
for me, it's a process, and I think for everyone, it's a process, and I think even like as I talk to people and as we talk today, I think that's one of the bigger concepts that we have to sit with is that it is a process and it's not linear, right? We're
Mhm.
going to regress. We always do. It's how growth works, is how emotional growth works. But it is a process. It's not like you've just hit this level of enlightenment. You're like, yo, I'm cool. No,
Mhm.
absolutely not.
Right. All right. I passed.
Yeah,
I graduated.
right.
I think that's one of the deepest explanations I've ever heard for emotional intimacy. I I completely agree and understand that. One thing you said that really stood out to me was that just because you don't access or you don't choose or you're not aware of the emotions, don't mean they don't show up. They are still showing up. And so if you felt like, well, if I like lock that off or if I don't, I compartmentalize that to not exist, that I'm not gonna feel that, you are not you setting yourself up to be
Yeah.
emotionally just
I mean,
drained and struggling at different times because those emotions do surface.
and it's
What
like,
we gonna say?
well, it's like a cancer, right? It's like, I know I should be dealing with this one thing, but I'm just going to push it to the side. And as you push it to the side, it weirdly like shows itself in different areas. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It weirdly shows itself, it metastasizes and moves to other places. Right. So this idea of like, I'm just going to not let them see my feelings. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
There's a fantastic phenomenon. I'm going to butcher it because it's not called this. There's probably some cool, like psychological phrase for it. But I call it the Bambi
Mhm.
effect, right? I call it the
Mhm.
Bambi effect, where you
Yep.
have those guys that'll go through hell. They've been through all of it. They feel that like you never see them sweat. And then
Mhm.
one day they're watching TV and then Bambi's mom gets killed and they're like in tears. And you're
Yeah.
like, wait a minute, when your cousin got killed, when these horrible things happened, you didn't cry at all, right? And
Right.
what it is, it's a manifestation of like, oh wow, all these feelings are in me. And since I didn't process them, now they're going to start to come out when I don't want them to come out, or they're going to come out
Yep.
in ways that are inopportune or in places that they just don't belong, right? And
Yeah.
and I think that
Yeah.
that's really what happens. And interestingly enough, I think that that's what drives a lot of men to therapy, right? I think that's what
Right.
drives a lot of men to come is when that kind of displacement happens, where they're like, oh wow, I don't get it. I don't know why I can't handle my
Yeah.
emotions. Why I don't get, a lot of times it's why don't I get promoted at work, right?
Hmm.
And it's
Yep.
because there's this weird kind of like emotional displacement that everybody else is picking up on, right?
Yeah.
But they don't know where it comes from. So
I know I like the way you explained that because I usually tell people, I'm like, yeah, when you're having a bigger reaction than like you kind of feel like, why am I like, acting like this? And like, that's not a new emotion. It's just, it's an emotion that came from another experience in the
for
past
sure,
that you haven't resolved yet.
for sure.
And it's showing up in these different experiences. So you can't even recognize the triggers. You just know this is like, why did, like you said, cry when I saw Bambi's mom die, but I've seen all these other deaths and they have a reaction to it.
Hmm.
You, it was something there. It's just that Bambi's mom is triggering that emotion. You know what I mean? So I really like the way you explained that. I even like the way you talked about how humbling being a parent is because there's this version of us as adults that's like, oh, I got it together. I'm not that kid anymore. I'm not a hot mess. All of the stuff we go through in those developmental years. And then being a parent, it's like I constantly have to like learn from maybe that's not the right approach, or maybe it's just different. And part of it is we're entering the next generation a lot of times, and the rules have changed every time. You enter a new generation. The societal rules kind of shift a little bit, and so like you talked about, he was like my dad was present, but he wasn't emotionally vulnerable. Right now, we're past that. We're in the next level of that. I am present as a dad, and I'm trying to be emotionally vulnerable because that is almost like the cycle, right? That you're breaking
For sure.
from the generation before you. Just like he broke the cycle of like I want to be a present dad in the home and be a father figure, all of those different things. And then as we kind of move on, the next generation hopefully has a new cycle that they can break. And so I like how you explained it in this specifically emotionally intimacy way, because it's like you said, it's a lot of this stuff is coming up. I was actually watching Inside Out, the little Disney movie,
Yeah,
in preparation to take my kids to see too. And it came out like so long ago. It was like 9, 10 years ago that, I literally forgot some of the story. And I was watching this one scene where the girl, she was having like, just a lot of emotional disruption inside, but she didn't know how to say it. And they're sitting at the dinner table, the family, the dad, you can see his emotions are choosing like which one gonna show up. Is anger gonna take over, because he's feeling disrespected, or is, like the other ones that's a little bit more compassionate gonna show up. And anger kept wanting to go in there. And so then she in her head, she's like, okay, who gonna respond? And so then you can see this back and forth. There's options on emotions to tap into, but sometimes because of where we either default to or we're conditioned to default to, sometimes we have an overriding emotion just take forefront, and these other emotions inside of us are battling like, okay, so what are we supposed to do with the same experience that, like you said, if my kid don't do something, it actually hurt my feelings, not, I'm mad because you didn't do it. It's coming from a different place of connection, of trust, which lends to really kind of understanding that emotional intimacy doesn't stop with you. It shows up in your relationships. And I hear you speaking to that. And so like like you want to speak to more of like even how it shows up in romantic relationships, friendships, family dynamics for men, because I'm hearing how it definitely showed up for you.
for sure, for sure. I mean, I think it's weird. It's not necessarily different, right? It's not
Hmm.
necessarily different in romantic It's like there's a narrative that just gets kind of superimposed on everything. You know what I mean? And for a lot of guys, I mean, when guys come in and we're talking and we're having these conversations as a clinician, some of the things that I'm thinking about for them is like, I need to understand if I could give a sentence to reflect this kind of internal struggle of their emotions, what would that sentence be? Right. And so for a lot of guys, it's like, my emotions are dangerous, right? My emotions are dangerous. Or it's like, if I let you see me emotional, you're going to take advantage of me, right? You're going to think I'm a punk. You know what I mean? And it gets
Yeah.
superimposed on all of those relationships. So I think for a lot of people, I mean, I'm simplifying it for a lot of people. I do think it is a complex process, but a lot of guys that I work with, it is that space. I know for me, it was just that of like, I can't let people take advantage of me, right? I grew up and I had this internal working model for myself of like, the world is a dangerous place. Everybody is going to take advantage of you if you give them the opportunity to. And you can never show weakness because if you do, they got you, right? And so like those are the things that made up my internal working model. So then whenever I would get into a new situations, those would be the things that I would just overlay into that relationship, right? So, there's plenty of like romantic relationships. I mean, I'm sure that, it probably would be like very interesting to do something like this with my wife. Because I'm sure she would just be on my shoulder, be like, no, you know what I mean? But like there there is there was times in my relationship with her where I was just shut down, right? I would
Mhm.
shut down because I would have a feeling and I'd be like, oh, I know this feeling, right? I'm intelligent enough to know the feeling. But then that paradigm is still overlaid of like, yeah, but if she knows how I feel, what's she gonna do with that information? Right? Is she gonna take advantage of me? Is she gonna go tell everybody? Am I gonna, turn around and be humiliated by it or whatever else it may be? You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
then what would happen would be I wouldn't share that emotion, or if I did, well, the only way it comes out is through anger, right? The only way it comes out is through anger, right?
Yeah.
There is a great line in jeez, my brain just stopped. There's a great line in the song 444 by Jay-Z, right? Where he's
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about his relationships and he's really talking about kind of the thing that we're talking about here, right? But he says,
Mhm.
I told you don't embarrass me instead of be mine, right? And it was
Yeah.
just like this juxtaposition of like, wow, yeah, no, that's exactly what he was saying, right? He was like, you know, I wanted to control you, but I didn't want to control you because I wanted to be in control of you. I wanted to control you because I was terrified you were going to leave me. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? And if I control you, then you couldn't leave me, right?
Mhm.
And I think that like all of those things come up in those relationships. Moreover, I mean, I think that as people listen to our conversation or they reflect on their lives, like this is a normal way of understanding the world, right? And whatever theoretical orientation you have, right? If you're a cognitive behavioral therapist, these are the schemas that come up, right? If you're a psychodynamic person, then these are the internal working models. These are the Jungian archetypes. You know what I mean? Like they're
Mhm.
all of these
Yep.
words to
Yep.
say the same thing. It's like we do this because it's a
Yep.
really efficacious way of navigating the world. But then what happens when one of two things happen, right? There's a great line in Will Smith's book. I don't know if we can talk about Will Smith because
Oh, yes, we sure can. Cause yeah.
but
Everything you reference, I'm like, "Yep, I know."
for sure. No, in his memoirs, he talks about uh, the development of the Fresh Prince, right?
Mhm.
And he says, the idea of the Fresh Prince was this. He said, he grew up with an abusive father. He grew up watching his father abuse his mother. And he was so ashamed of himself because he didn't stand up to his father, right? His father didn't abuse him. His father was really tough on him in a different way, but he was like, I should have always stood up to my father. And he was like, so when I thought about how I saw myself, I was weak. I was a punk, right? Like I wasn't good enough. I was XYZ.
Our yeah.
And so he says, like, so what did I do? I created the persona of the Fresh Prince so that everybody else wouldn't see that, right? As an ego defense mechanism, so everybody else wouldn't see that. And then he says, like
Mhm.
later on, like he got all of this fame, he got all of this positivity from it, this positive feedback from the world. He became the Fresh Prince and blah, blah, blah. And then he said there became a point in my life where I realized that although that archetype, that paradigm, that template helped me navigate these things, it became maladaptive because I couldn't grow anymore. Right? I couldn't grow in my relationships. I couldn't grow as a father. I couldn't grow as a son. I couldn't grow anymore because that was hindering me. And I had to realize, like, how do I let it go? Right. So then fast forward, like I read the book, and then fast forward to me seeing him slapping Chris Rock, right?
Right.
And in my world, everyone was like, "Oh my God, clutch my pearls." You know what I mean? And in my world,
Right. No, I was like,
yeah, of course
yeah,
he did.
I
Yeah,
get it.
of course he did. He finally stood up for his mom, right?
Yep.
It was like,
Yep.
"Oh,
I love
wait,
talking
hold
to
on."
people who learn mental health because you get it.
For sure, for
Yes.
sure. But it is about understanding those archetypes and understanding, this is what I'm doing. Is it efficacious now? Or do I actually need to change these paradigms? Do I need to change these archetypes? Fortunately, I think that the world of mental health, especially amongst people of color, especially amongst Black men, the tide is really changing. There are people who there's no way in the world they're gonna step foot in my office. There's people that are like, no, look, let's do this. Like I got it, right? And so the tide is changing where people can be reflective of that. But realistically, I mean, I'm not gonna blame all of society's ailments on like the lack of like emotional intimacy or emotional awareness of themselves. But a lot of times that archetype never gets thrown to the side. It never gets changed. It never gets assimilated. And so then that's when we see people engage in these pathological behaviors, right? That's when we see, the people that are in jail, that are committing crimes, that are, they got 5, 6, 7, 8 baby mamas. They're emotionally or physically abusive towards themselves, their partners, their children, right? And those are the people that don't actually like take that step to look at the archetype. And so part of what I do in treatment and part of what I do to work with people is just that. I'm gonna show you some things that you don't want to see, right? Is let's try on these different hats and let's see which one of these fits you, right? And which one of them has been useful to kind of protect this emotional vulnerability, to kind of hide some of those things. And can we take it off, right? Can we
Yeah.
take that hat off and actually look at, how you feel about yourself, or look at, in my instance was like, look at like, can I truly be open to somebody else and say like, well, I don't know why I got Jay-Z on the mind, right? But he said I'm gonna play spades with the cards face up, right? Can I give you all the keys and the security codes? You know what I mean? And most people, I'm not saying just jump off the roof and figure it out, right? It is kind of a slow let's test the waters, let's put your foot in the water and see if you can actually tolerate this. But it is a huge place. But once again, we go all the way back around to where you started from, where we started from. I do think that is kind of how it manifests itself in all of these different relationships. It's not really going to be different. My hypothesis is that once we understand that archetype, it's going to look the same with your wife. It's going to look the same with your kids. It's going to look the same with your friends. It's going to look the same with your employers. I just think the thing that becomes different is the outcome from it, right? The
Yeah.
outcome of this like lack of emotional intimacy in all of these different places. It's going to look different.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. I read this book called What Happened to You. I forgot. I cannot say the names right now without looking at it, but I know Oprah was on there too. But and this psychiatrist, and she talked about if you look at the thread in the relationships, you'll see the pattern, and that kind of to me speaks to what you are talking about, the archetypes. Like when you see this pattern, you can see the weaknesses or the strengths or, just the pros and the cons and how you're showing up in those relationships or what you gravitate towards or what you limit yourself to, because some people, they're close to the people and you can see that. And some people, they kind of keep this distance all the time. Don't let anybody get too close.
Hmm.
And it's like, it follows those different relationships. I got the mentions that earlier you said something that I thought was super, I just thought, it should be reiterated because it was huge. There is no finish line of growth, right? Like growth is a ongoing iterative process. And like you said, there is times when you may kind of fall back and slip up some. There's times when you are moving forward. But to think that you're going to hit a finish line with growth, you're going to shortchange yourself and then you're going to stop growing. And so if you are reflective, right, then you can always look at opportunities for growth. And something else you mentioned was how growth is a parallel process. And when you are showing up in spaces where, like in our case, where we might be helping somebody else or like, with their own mental health, their relationships in some way, but we're also working on these things and strengthening these areas in our lives. And so it's kind of like this parallel process. I'm hoping that I'm, making enough progress and doing enough healing and work on myself to be able to guide you, effectively, and also my family and my kids or, those types of things, because we're in this iterative process of growing and learning. And some of this is abstract until you're in it. Like it's only so much somebody can tell you about parenting until you're a parent. And so like you're just gonna see some of the things that you didn't expect to see or run into some of the answers you didn't have answers or questions you didn't have answers to. And it's just it's unavoidable just because of how life works, right? So I thought I just have to reiterate that growth doesn't stop. With this space of just, strengthening emotional intimacy, especially in relationships, what are some communication strategies that you can recommend for men to build that emotional intimacy with their partners?
I think it starts from within. Once again, I think I use the Brom from Renner like ecosystem concept, which is like the Russian
Mm.
nesting doll, right? Like, there's a big one, and every time you take time you remove a part of it, there's something smaller inside. I think this concept works the same way, right? Is that it has to start from the core, so it has to start with you reflecting on once again maybe what is that archetype that you have, things that protecting from. Why do I protect from those things? To be able to solidify yourself, to understand, like, okay, well, how do I then put this into the next level of it, right? We mentioned in the beginning of like, yeah, it is about the partners, right? So a lot of times what I would see was that there's a certain couple that I work with, and I think about them all the time because they're a high conflict couple, right? They're a high conflict couple. Both of them come in with their own baggage, and but I started off working with the husband first, and he and I worked together for maybe about a year and a half, on just this. Hey, my anger, I use the phrase that we all hate, right? My toxic masculinity is impacting my relationship with my wife, but it's also impacting my relationship with my kids, right? Like my kids see me as this angry tyrant of a man, and I'm not that. Like actually, I'm really sensitive and I'm really emotional, and and the reason why I'm doing these things is not because I'm angry, and it's because I'm scared, right? It's because I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm not going to be a good enough husband for my wife. I'm scared that
Oh,
my kids aren't going to have the same, aren't going to have enough or get enough from me, right? And so part of what he and I had to work with was him being able to identify those things within himself. Is that most of the things that he was doing, a lot of this lashing out, this anger, this lack of emotional availability or intelligence was really more based off his fear, right? And so we were
mm,
able to do that, and we did that for a while, and it was fantastic. And he was like, "Doc, I'm feeling so great," and blah blah blah. But then every week he would come in and be like, "Yo, we got into it again," and I'd be like, "Well, what happened?" Right? And he would be like, "I came in and we kind of got into it, and I would come to my wife, and I'd be like, you know what? I'm just scared." And the response that I would hope she would have given would have been, "Wow, I feel terrible for you." You know what she says? "Stop being a bitch. Man up.
my goodness.
Like, we're not here for that." You know what I mean? And it was like, "Oh, wait a minute. We've unlocked his emotional intimacy, right? But the
Yeah.
second level of the
But
system isn't ready to actually hold it." You know what I mean? And so a lot of times it's not about necessarily what you say to your significant other, what you say to them. it's understanding whether or not that second level of the emotional intimacy is even ready to hold that.
Yeah.
And part of it is I tell people a lot of times, this is where therapy is always really, really good because I'm sure there's a lot of women out there that just love me or hate me because I tell my clients, just blame it on me. Right? Like, be like,
Right.
my therapist said to me today, he said, fill in the blank. What you think of that? What you think of that? You know what I mean? And I'm like, I don't know how your relationship is with your partner, but like, if my wife says something to me that I've been saying and I've been knowing for a long time, I'll be like, say what? You know what I mean? I'm like, oh, okay. All right, keep talking, right? Look, now we can finally have this
Right.
conversation, right? But it is
Right.
about being able to like find ways to approach those conversations. And like I said, relying on therapy, saying like, hey, doc said this to me. This is what I think. But it also could be, I mean, I do a lot of different styles of therapy, but in when I work with couples, I really, really love like narrative approaches. So I really love having this like projective, analytic, narrative third where I can say, you know what I want you to do, man, is I want you to sit down and I want you to just sit with your wife and tell her your story, right? Tell her your story about how you came to be the man that you are now. And I'm gonna give him something so that the wife can ask some open-ended, reflective questions, right? So that some of those pieces can start to happen to be opened up. Some of those places can get explored, right? And it's even through that like narrative story. The story is my story, but it's not me saying this is how I feel, right? Because that's still may be dangerous, right? But this is me testing the waters to say like, this is what it looks like, right? So the same way that I tell you stories about me when we're talking here, and I'm telling you stories about my relationship or all those other things, that's the same type of thing that I would encourage men to be talking to their wives about, or their girlfriends, or boyfriends, or whoever their partners are. I also think it's important, like we talk about partners, we also talk about kids, right? Not that I think that your child should be responsible for your emotional vulnerability, right? But I do think that that's a part of the process as well about being able to sit there and kind of model some of these things for your children about like, oh, what does this look like? How does this go? But I don't think that there's like specific things that people should say, right? I think that
Right.
those are really more nuanced or those types of pieces. But I do think that there are approaches like telling stories or like having reflective conversations about what somebody else told you that actually open up the gates or open up the conversations about like emotional vulnerability so that they can see that
Yes.
next level happens, right? And then even when we
Yeah.
think about it, like that's a way that we kind of move on to all of those different types, right? So the next in that context, the next level would be like the extended family and the community, right? So like, how do I understand if the extended family and then the community, like work settings or church or friends, like I understand if they're ready for that, right? And then even bigger, right? We talk about like the societal system, right? How do I understand how my emotional vulnerability fits into the societal system, right?
Yeah.
As a
Yeah.
42-year-old man, my emotional vulnerability fits into the societal system differently now than a 22-year-old man, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't pose as much as a threat. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I mean, I like to think I don't pose as much as a threat. You know what I mean? But it does mean something different. But there are those ways of testing those waters, of putting those things out there, of being able to be open and understanding of what you're putting out there, but also being cognizant of like, okay, how am I truly interpreting the response that I'm actually getting now? Right. And I think that
Yeah.
becomes the bigger piece when we talk about like in relationships is how are you understanding that response? Bianca, if
Mhm.
you and I are in a relationship and I say, wow, I'm hurt. And then you say, really? Well, okay, now I got to understand I got to understand what you just told me. Right.
Yeah.
I got
Yeah.
to understand what you just told me, but I also have to be cognizant of I'm already coming with this air of like defensiveness and fear. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So when you say, oh, really? Am I going to say, see, I told you she wasn't ready for it. I told you she was going to take it. I told you she'd think I'm Or am I going to say,
Yeah.
well, she wants to know more? You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like it's about being able to help people understand and have it, or understand and interpret the response that they get from society.
Wow. Yeah. Very, very good. When you were talking about it, I'm glad you said it, but I was hearing emotional vulnerability. Like it's a risk to say I'm going to open up this part of me that is a little bit more sensitive, or a area that I don't access, tell you my story, share my deeper emotions so that you don't just see anger or the blow up or whatever.
Hmm.
That was like huge because that's a part of that growth, that and perspective, right? Being able to give yourself a chance to interpret that from a different lens. It makes me think about the show Power,
Hmm.
when James St. Patrick, when he was going into that space of, I wanna like live life in a um just non, I guess, legal way, and also like where he can reach different career goals and political goals. And his wife was, she didn't meet that version of him. She met the version of him that was in survival mode, that was pushing major weight, that helped them reach the success that they reached in their life, where they lived in this big penthouse and in New York and all of this. And she wanted that life. And so she kind of almost like rejected and sometimes even sabotaged his desire to grow professionally, but I would say also emotionally, because she was just like not willing to let him come out of that space of, I did this out of survival and now I don't have to do this. Let me do something that, is kind of the natural next step if you're trying to grow. She was like, no, we don't want that over here.
And
So
I love
I totally,
I love
yeah.
that you brought up power, because I think that power is like the perfect story to even like talk about what we're talking about, right? Because for him, it wasn't just his wife; it was
Hmm.
everybody,
It
right?
was
It was
everybody.
it was his best friend, it was
Tommy,
his business partners, it was his
his
son,
kid.
right? Like all of them had to like adapt, or he had to figure out, how do I let this? Because yes, you're right. He didn't want to be Ghost anymore, right?
Right,
He didn't want to be
right.
Ghost anymore. He wanted to be a mogul. He wanted to be all of these other things. You know, that obviously him being Ghost got him where he needed to be, but when he was ready to get rid of it, the rest of him
Yeah.
wasn't prepared for it.
Hi, and thank you for tuning into this episode so far. But we're going to pause it right here because this episode is getting good and we have so much more to cover. We want to let this sink in for you. Some things to be prepared for that are coming are going to be things like the consequences of when men are lacking emotional intelligence, how to navigate some of the stigma around men expressing their emotions, the role social media plays into it, cultural differences for men expressing their emotions, and so much more. Like I said, we have so much in store. And so we're pausing it here just to give you a break, but we do want you to tune in. Dr. Frank Byndloss has so much more to offer and share with you guys. And the conversation, of course, gets better and better. So just tune in and see what we're getting to next. Thank you.